Good morning, and we are letting attendees into the webinar. We will start in very short order. The webinar is being recorded, and there is simultaneous interpretation into Spanish available as well. We'll give it just a couple more minutes. All right. Good morning. Welcome to the FIT North America International Translators Day webinar for 2020. My name is Bill Rivers. I'm the chair of FIT North America, and I am also part of the American Translators Association. And joining us today, we have Donald Barabé, who is the president of l'Ordre des Traducteurs, Terminologues et Interprètes Agréés du Québec, OTIAC, and Georgeanne Weller, who is representing el Colegio Mexicano, Interprètes de Conferencias. And our task today is to really lay out some of the trends that we've seen during the pandemic and how they're affecting the membership of our organizations and our work. Our colleagues are going to come at this from different perspectives. I will let them introduce themselves and credential themselves, provide their biographies. But they are all leaders in North America in translation and interpreting. And all of us have worked, I think, very hard to adapt to the conditions of the pandemic, and with the uncertainty that brings, trying to use what we have to help our members and to continue to provide translation and interpreting to people who need it. And we'll start with Donald Barabé. We're going to go in alphabetical order by last names. I'm not very creative this morning. I will turn it over to you, Donald.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. Thank you very much for everyone to be here. It's really a pleasure to be here today. As Bill said, I'm the president of the Ordre des Traducteurs, Terminologues et Interprètes Agréés du Québec, which is one of the very few licensing boards for certified translators, interpreters, and terminologists in the world. Before that, I was vice president of the Canadian Government Translation Bureau, and as such, I was responsible for the translation services to all government departments and agencies. So, finding the words for a world in crisis. So, as we are supposed to speak about words, how about start with the etymology of the word crisis? In ancient Greek, it meant crisis with a K. It meant the need to discriminate, to distinguish, the need to make choices. And hard choices, it is something that we have to do in this health crisis that we're going through. Later on in Middle Ages Latin, it came to meant violent outburst of a disease. So it is really directly related to what we've been going through. So we're going through a violent outburst of COVID-19, and it is forcing us to make hard choices. One of the difficult choices that we did not have to make as translators is teleworking, or telepracticing, as I prefer to use. I think it's a better word for professionals, telepracticing. Telepracticing is something that we've been doing forever, and the rest of the world is simply catching up to us. So going back to this year's ITD's theme, finding the words for a world in crisis, some people may think that since translators translate words, it should come easy to us to find the words for a world in crisis. Actually, as professional translators, we know that translators do not translate words. They translate ideas, notions, concepts, information. In summary, they translate the message carried by the words. So it does not come to us as easy as some people may think to find words. Case in point, and this is something I want to focus on this morning, case in point, translating and interpreting in native languages and in sign languages. It is not easy to find the words for translators and interpreters into native languages or for sign language interpreters, especially when the words do not exist. We had the pleasure some months ago, in this past November in Montreal, looks like decades ago. So we had the pleasure to host a FIT North America event on native languages. And at that event, an elder from an elder tribe member spoke to us about native languages and native issues. After his speech, I had a conversation with him about specialized terminology, like technical terminology or scientific terminology. And he told me that the word cancer for the disease is translated, in his native language as spider, because for them, the disease creates webs in the body, metaphorically speaking, of course. So imagine now for the words that they have to use for serologic testing. Ageusia, it means the loss of the sense of taste. So what they have to do is use paraphrasing in a large extent, and in less of an extent, sometimes borrowing terms. So the challenge is the same for sign language interpreters. And I want to conclude on this. However they do it, they manage to convey the meaning, the message across, and probably in a way that will enrich their vocabulary forever. This gives a new meaning to Churchill's famous observation, never let a good crisis go to waste. Thank you all, and I'll be waiting for questions.
Thank you, Donald. And now we turn to Georgeanne. And Georgeanne, if you could give us a little bit of background about yourself, and then we will hear your intervention. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Bill. I'll be glad to. Good morning to everybody. I will try not to speak too fast, because as a conference interpreter, I know how that complicates life. Yes, I'm representing the Colegio Mexicano de Intérpretes de Conferencias, known as CEMIC. I'm also a member here in Mexico of the OMT, the Organización Mexicana de Traductores, and I'm the president of the AC Intérpretes y Traductores en Servicios Públicos y Comunitarios, which is for speakers of the indigenous languages, which would be the central part of my talk this morning. So once again, what's happening in Mexico? That's a big shoe to try to put my foot into, right? Because unfortunately, even though we're in close contact through the professional associations and personally, because of the pandemic, it has not allowed us to carry out our life as usual. We've been very much affected in conference interpreting. Since almost everything is virtual, we were caught a little bit, as the expression goes, with their pants down, or with their doors in the fingers in the door, excuse me. And we've had to really move fast to go into RSI, remote simultaneous interpretations. CEMIC has been particularly helpful in organizing sessions, which are both theoretical and practical, which we've been able to take from home. And this has been very, very good for us. Of course, it's easier said than done, but at least we're on the right track. And we think distance interpreting or remote interpreting is here to stay. Hopefully we'll be able to get back on site. I think everybody misses, turning to their booth mate and getting, comparing notes over coffee and the breaks, etc. But right now that's going to be impossible. I don't have exact statistics, but according to the emails that have come and gone, about 80% of the work that we did traditionally at conferences, of course, has gone. It's blown away. This is also true, for example, let's talk a little bit about translators, because FEAT is the International Federation for Translators. Conference translation hasn't been around much for the past few years, but right now, as far as I know, there's no conference translation on site. The documents are being sent to the person at home. And of course, the translation sector has not been hit nearly as hard as the interpreting sector, since for many years, people translate at home, they have their equipment, and this is something we've had to take into account, and the warning is out, and I think all of us agree with it, not to undercut, not to charge less for remote interpreting, because people say, oh, you don't have to pay for transportation, you don't have to pay for lunch, you don't have to pay for parking, you don't have to get dressed. Yes, but you need a lot of support equipment, preferably a second screen, a good headset and microphone, and you really have to know how to do this. So translators, once again, probably 90% were already working at home. Okay, I've been asked to talk, to center my remarks on what's happening with Indigenous interpreters and translators during the COVID crisis. This has been a major problem. I'd like to break my remarks up into three categories. First of all, the Indigenous population, which has remained in their communities. I mean, that's very diverse, but that's one aspect. Another are those who live in metropolitan areas, particularly Mexico City and the outskirts, Guadalajara and Monterrey. And the third population is the migrating population. Poor things. We'll see what all of this means. So you can't just talk about, Mexico's Indian, this is what's happening with Indigenous interpreters and translators. I think it's very different. In general, there has not been as high an incidence of death and sickness in Indian communities because they've blocked them off. They literally won't let you in. And this is because it's very hard for them culturally to maintain social distance. What do you mean social distance when people are piled on top of each other, sharing a home, there are 10 kids and the grandmother and the grandfather and the aunt and the uncle? It's almost impossible to maintain social distance. In many of the Indian cultures, wearing a mask doesn't have the connotation like for us. We feel oppressed and all of these medical considerations, and nobody wants to wear a mask, but we have to. For them, wearing a mask is like a masquerade. It's more of a celebration. It's used a lot of carnivals and their own traditional ceremonies. So there's a lot of cultural distance here. Once again, there certainly are medical facilities. However, it might only be an outlying post where the doctor goes 3 times a week, etc. But they are not inclined to get vaccinations, to be kind of guinea pigs for these experiments. They have their own traditional medicine, and it's very hard. So the rules that we say, wash your hands, yeah, that's fine if you've got soap and running water. Wear a mask, keep social distance. It's very hard to apply these. These are Western, these are mainstream considerations. But I think they're probably right. If you block yourself off, well, hopefully you won't become infected. Here in the Mexico City metropolitan area, There have been a lot of attempts by the INALI, which is the Instituto Nacional de Lenguas Indígenas, also by the Secretaría de Salud, and here in Mexico City, the Secretaría de Pueblos y Barrios Originarios y Comunidades Indígenas Residentes. That's a mouthful. The title is very long, but they have also, and Naucalpan, which is in the state of Mexico, just outside of Mexico City. I think most of you are familiar with Washington, D.C. And in Virginia, you can't really say we're going to apply this in Washington, D.C. It has to be applied in the surrounding states of Virginia and Maryland because there's so much going back and forth. I mean, you would have to stop and check everybody's temperature, you know, their bridges. So it's not easy to do. There are no bridges like that over the water in Mexico City. But now Calpin has been covering Nahuatl and Otomi with audiovisual materials. These are very good posters, which are simple. We have to remember that many speakers of the indigenous languages cannot read or write in that language. So you don't want to put one of these heavily weighted written posters with all the things you have to do. It has to be like a very active, almost like a primary school poster would be, with a lot of large designs, etc. And in Mexico City, they're trying to cover Mazateco, Otomi, Triqui, Mixteco, and Zapoteco. People don't think of Mexico City as an indigenous community, and of course it's not, but there are hundreds of thousands of speakers of Mexico's indigenous languages who have migrated and settled in certain parts of Mexico City. It's not just the ones you see out on the streets selling little dolls, but they're in construction, they're in gardening, they're in places where you wouldn't necessarily identify them as speakers of the Indian languages. But of course, this is very difficult. How do you cover all of that? Once again, Mexico's linguistic diversity is an asset. It's part of our national heritage, patrimony, and everybody says, wow, 11 families, 68 languages, and 364 variations. Wow, Mexico's just so rich, so blessed. Yes, but when you sift all of this information down to practical points, like how to provide interpretation and translation services, you've got the problem of people not reading and writing, of all of these variations, they can't understand each other. And sometimes the variations are small enough that they can be overcome, but other times they're not. So what they're doing in a lot of the communities is having simple traditional medicine practices, and also they use vans with speakers, like loudspeakers, because then it reaches everybody in the community. And those who can't read or write, well, it doesn't matter. They receive the message orally. So I think this is very, very interesting. This has been done for years, but it has been a more active practice with the COVID virus, since most people don't go to the neighboring towns. There used to be so many tianguis, you know, and one group would come down from the mountains and meet with another group alongside of the river, and they would all sell their wares, their local food, etc. That has been curtailed considerably right now because of this policy of many communities saying, well, if you're not a member of the community, you can't get in. It's like if you don't have a visa, you know, you have a passport but not a visa to get in, well, you have to stay out, you know, come back some other time. So once again, I certainly agree with Donald that words don't have any meanings. There's no exact equivalent between Mexican Spanish, and I do mean, you know, once again, Mexican Spanish is not the only Spanish, it's one of the many Spanishes. But once again, you can't necessarily interpret or translate at the word level. You have to move up much higher. And yes, you know, borrowing terms are used a lot. Numbers are used a lot because most of the Indian groups count by 20s, not by 10s. So all of these things make it very, very difficult to get the word out. They do have radio. Many of them are attending the video conferences, which are part of Mexico's school system right now at the SEP, at the Secretaría de Educación Pública. The signal reaches many of them, but not all of them, nor do all the children have computers. They might have cell phones, but not computers. So it's a real problem right now. It's hard enough because they basically have to learn in a second language, which is Spanish. That's not their native language. And this is very different. You know, this is not the same thing. If you all think, gee, if I had to learn through Russian, if you're going, oh, you know, how would I have ever done my homework? How do you learn the multiplication tables and when 20s are used instead of 10s? And all the little machines are built to handle a different type of numbers and words. And once again, we can't stay at the word level. Words don't mean the same thing. There's a heavy cultural content. You can't separate language and culture. Culture will be reflected in language, but the underlying difference are cultural difference. So, and I want to touch briefly because I'm hogging the time. The third aspect, we've talked about people who live in their communities, people who live in Mexico City, who are in contact, who do receive much more visual and audio impact, but also in their native language. The third population are the migrating Indian populations. No one has any idea about how many speakers of indigenous languages are migrating to Sinaloa and Sonora. These are northwestern states in Mexico. They go there to harvest seasonal crops, to have money. They tend to group according to their ethnicity and their language. For many people, this is their end destination, their final destination, so to say. But for many others, they continue to go into California and Central California, once again, for crops to earn in dollars, all the way up to Washington and Oregon. And of course, right now, many of them are stuck or stranded outside of their communities in the northwestern part of Mexico City because its laws have been so stringent, not just legality. We've already had enough of that at the border. We know what Trump's policies are, but simply for medical reasons, they can't get through. They can't, it's too risky to try to cross the border underground in tunnels or in these old trucks. Well, it's another hazard to health. And so they've been stuck in the middle, so to speak, and don't have enough money to get back. And this is a population, I don't know what's happening in Sonora and Sinaloa. I haven't had time to look into that, nor do I have very good contacts there. But I think this population must be particularly vulnerable because they tend to harvest like tobacco and Nayarit, and they're out there with a lot of sprays. So they already have underlying conditions, especially respiratory diseases. And this COVID virus has, you know, just added to their misery. So once again, I think I've probably said enough for anybody who wants questions at the end. We all know that the topic of indigenous languages, not only saving them, so to speak, or revitalizing them, but promoting and developing them and finding new windows of opportunity. And that's why interpretation and translation is so important. We are giving courses at the ACE, Servicios Públicos y Comunitarios. We are helping to train. The UNALI is certifying indigenous interpreters and translators, but there's not enough. There's never enough time. And once again, we go back to the problem, okay, who's going to do the training? How culturally sensitive are they? How do languages translate among each other? The lack of prestige in Mexico for Indian languages. you know, everybody says, you say, oh, he's bilingual, English, French, Spanish, Portuguese. And you say, well, he's bilingual, he speaks Zapoteco and Cholo. And people say, those are dialects. Can you write them? Who would be interested in speaking to indigenous languages? Well, actually, it's very useful on a local basis. So I think there are lots of considerations that we have to take into account. And I think I see my colleague from ATA is about chomping at the bit, anxious to tell. No. You want me to keep going? Anxious to tell his story. So I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Georgeanne. And now I turn it over to Ted Wozniak, the president of the American Translators Association. Ted.
Thank you, Bill. My name is Ted Wozniak. As Bill mentioned, I am the president of the American Translators Association, ATA. I am a German into English financial translator and have been for, well, more years than I care to think about at the moment. I'm going to take a slightly different tack on the topic today and focus more on what the association and more actually our members, the individuals, have done, how it's impacted them, and what the association has done to try to help our translators and interpreter in helping them deal with this crisis. As was already mentioned, one of the first fallouts from the pandemic was, of course, that conference interpreting just died overnight. It's just, you know, from one day to the next, there was just no business at all, and the rest of the interpreting or in-person interpreting work followed quickly in getting canceled. And then the next, pretty much simultaneously again, was then, as has been mentioned, we have a new problem, which is there's new language, new terminology. And so there was a need for COVID-related language resources that had to be done very quickly. And again, as also has been mentioned, indigenous languages, there was a problem where, again, some terms and concepts simply don't exist in those languages, and you had to find workarounds. And how do you explain concepts for when the languages just don't have the words at hand? And thanks to a lot of individuals who tackle these problems with terminology and coming up both for, the more common language as well, but they started developing COVID terminology, language resources, and sharing them, among their networks. And thankfully, ATA was able to help with that, again, because we are a pretty large network. So that was one of the first things that ATA did. And also another action that ATA took was for our interpreter colleagues, who, particularly the ones who were used to doing in person, all of a sudden they needed to find out about how do I do remote interpreting and the various types of remote interpreting, over the phone, OPI, and video remote, VRI, and remote simultaneous interpreting, RSI. And many of them had to deal with that. So we quickly got together some webinars that we offered for free so that they could get up to speed on this, for them, new technology that was replacing in-person interpreting. Our divisions, but in particular our interpreters division, as well as our regional and local chapters, were very important channels for disseminating this information and providing training, especially for local and community interpreters. On a broader level, as well, in addition to providing training and education for interpreters, client education was also an important aspect, particularly for those interpreters who were still working in person. There was wasn't entirely shut down, but we needed to educate clients to make sure that, you know, what was a safe work environment, and making sure that in-person interpreters were provided adequate protective equipment, PPE. And then as remote interpreting started coming to the fore, they also, again, had to be educated on how and when to use remote interpreting options and what the challenges were that that mode of interpreting presents, because it's different from in person. Another aspect where ATA, I think, has played a good role, and as I'm sure all our associations have, was in helping mitigate the economic impact of the pandemic. Certainly, you know, interpreters obviously felt a huge loss of work, and even translators, you know, it's been a mixed bag. We surveyed our members. We didn't break down into interpreting and translating, was just our members as a whole, but 60% of them reported that they had seen a large drop in revenue since the beginning of the year. And another around 18% reported some decline, but not severe. But so we have all these members who unfortunately had a lot of newfound but unwelcome free time. So in order to help them and give them something to do to fill up that free time, as well as take a little sting out of the loss of revenue, one of the first things we did was made our virtual 58th annual conference available free of charge to our members, so that they could go online and get some training for free, and certainly help them get their continuing education points that they might need. We also increased promotion of our resources, such as our client outreach kit, several webinars on how to build up your business, and our other information sources, such as our division listservs, our business practices listservs, where, and I think this is very important, where individual members can share their experiences as they were learning how to cope with the pandemic, as well as seek advice from their colleagues. At the same time, of course, we had the federal government debating, and actually, rare instance, they actually acted pretty quickly in a bipartisan fashion for once. They did roll out some economic relief measures very quickly. Right at the onset of that, ATA and we were one of the voices advocating for the inclusion of independent contractors in benefits that had traditionally been extended only to employees. This was a huge precedent was set when the United States Congress made freelancers, independent contractors, eligible for state unemployment benefits. So that's a first, and we'll see how that plays out in the future and when the next crisis comes. Possibly more important to our individual members was the constant stream of information that we were providing about the other economic measures that Congress was doing. There was the Payroll Protection Program called PPP, and the Economic Industry Disaster Loans, EIDL. I started providing some information about these programs as it was rolling out, and then quickly my friend and colleague Robin Baumthrone, who I want to give a personal shout out to here, soon took over the lead in keeping track of what were almost daily changes to these programs and the rules and how it was going to be implemented. And Robin was putting almost daily updates and advice on our various information channels to inform members about how they could take advantages of these economic incentives provided by Congress. And I would say thanks to Robin and his constant updates, numerous ATA members were successfully applied for and got these grants and loans. At the same time, many of ATA's local and regional chapters, which include a large number of individuals who are not ATA members, also played a major role in helping the regional and ATA members during the pandemic. In addition to providing resources such as the COVID terminology I mentioned previously, they also provided free or low-cost webinars and other professional development training to make up for the loss of in-person events, while simultaneously providing some small measure of economic relief to their measures. And we're continuing. You know, the crisis is not over yet, and so every month we're providing a free webinar to all our members, and we're keeping up with the pace has slowed down a little bit. Congress is debating a new economic relief passage, and the bipartisanship that was shown at the initial has sort of disappeared now in the run up to the election, but that's politics. So, but we're trying to stay on top of things. And again, I think the most important role that the association has played is primarily as an information channel, and just making sure that our members got up-to-date information, got the resources they needed to help them in doing their job, particularly interpreters during this pandemic. And then secondarily, helping all our members out with some affordable or free professional development training, and helping them steer their business through this pandemic. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ted. I just want to make a few remarks. So I'll take the prerogative of the chair of the session. And it would be trite and for me to say that COVID has affected absolutely everything, but it really has. When we look at just the massive change in how we do interpreting now, that's this shift to remote simultaneous interpreting on an unprecedented scale. And I think looking forward, and that'll be probably the first question that I'll put to the group after I'm done going on a bit. Looking forward is the question: how much of that will be permanent? And maybe just throw that out right now. Watching how much of conference interpreting, medical interpreting, legal interpreting is now done, educational interpreting is now done virtually. We have remote simultaneous interpreting on this Zoom event. How rapidly Zoom has incorporated, Zoom and other platforms have incorporated remote interpreting, and how interpreting specific platforms have very rapidly evolved in the last 6 to 7 months. How permanent do we see this? And I'll start with maybe Georgeanne can answer that.
Well, Georgeanne can't answer that, but she'll make a stab at it.
We will speculate.
You're right. I think RSI is here to stay. On the one hand, I think most interpreters want to get back to on-site interpretation, because you can have the personal contact. I mean, your booth mate could be in another country or something like that. And I think we're social beings, we're human beings who need social support and need to be with each other. But I also think that this is not just in passing, that you say, okay, as soon as the vaccine's out, we're all going to go back to the life we held previously. I think this is affecting interpretation, of course, much more than translation. But translators, we're also people, right? We like to be in touch. There's nothing better than getting together to, especially if you're working on a team effort, all 4 of you together. Well, I put this and why did you put that? Okay, let's reach an agreement on what term we're going to use, because we can't have each chapter with its own terminology. So translators also need contact. They don't just have to be in touch with machines. And but I think we have to accept what is going to be the new reality, so to speak, and prepare ourselves. And it has advantages as well, not having to leave your house. But you know, you don't want this day after day after day after day. You feel, you know, locked in, and we need to see each other. We need to work with each other. We need to give each other a hug, right? A fraternal hug. Okay, so that's how I'd answer your question, Bill.
Donald?
Pretty much in the same line than Georgeanne. We're seeing now remote court proceedings.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it will never go back to zero, but it won't. So but it won't stay remote. That's for sure. So I think it's going to be the same thing for interpretation. What's going to be the right balance? It's going to be. We'll see. We'll see.
Ted?
Yeah, I think I would generally agree. Obviously, remote translation in its various forms is here to stay. I think as much as interpreters, particularly conference interpreters, would like to go back to 100% in person, I just don't see that happening from the economic perspective. The buyers, the people who pay the bills are looking at saving these costs of not having to pay travel and the other incidental expenses. While the cost of the interpretation may be the same, or actually I would say should actually be higher, because I think it's more difficult for the interpreters to do remote than on site. So they actually should be getting paid more for the actual interpreting, whether they can make that or not. But again, the economics overall, there'll be some return, but I think a large percentage, and I wouldn't hazard a guess as to how much, is definitely going to stay remote simply because of the economics, And the other thing is, again, remote, not related to interpreting, is all of our, just like these meetings and events, all of our conferences have been remote this year. And I think going forward, whenever we do go back to our in-person interpreter and T&I events, they're going to be hybrid. There's going to be a remote component on all of those going forward, simply because it just opens them up to all these people that couldn't afford to do the travel before, and it works. So
Yeah, that's been the surprising thing to me, is just how quickly we've adapted as within T&I to working, and translators often working remotely, and essentially, but with interpreting, how rapidly that's changed and how rapidly we've developed these online events, and that there's a leveling of the playing field for folks, as Ted notes, who can participate virtually without the cost of travel and hotel and such. The other remark, I want to draw some parallels between Donald's remarks about First Nations languages in Canada and the challenges of terminology development for the COVID crisis that Ted remarked on with what ATA has done, that even terminology in major world languages was underdeveloped in COVID. Interestingly enough, when I read Québécois newspapers and magazines versus Parisian, there's a different article for la COVID or le COVID sometimes. That's just really getting down into the linguistic weeds. And then what Georgeanne was talking about with the indigenous communities of Mexico, one of the very positive outcomes of last year's seminar on the International Year of Indigenous Languages, which was hosted by OTIAC in November of last year, and that Donald mentioned, is there's now a project for a terminology corpus for Mexican indigenous languages and healthcare and immigration, because this is a pressing concern on the U.S. southern border, as many people know, but also with 250,000 Zapotecos in California, that there are huge needs for all sorts of interpreting there. So we're seeing some really interesting cross-border collaboration, projects led by Odilia Romero, who was one of the speakers last year in Montreal, with cooperation from Kent State University and Sue Ellen Wright. So it's a really nice, and some other folks, really nice international effort. And then the final thing, before we turn this over to the audience, is that we've known that we need better standards for remote simultaneous interpreting. ISO TC 37, Technical Committee 37, Subcommittee 5 on Translation and Interpreting has some technical standards about the equipment and the quality of the internet connection, the acoustic characteristics and responses of the headphones and the microphones and so on. But we know that we do need better standards for the actual process itself that cover the cognitive load, which is very different than in-person interpreting. That cover the training, which you have to train for the technology, but again, as Georgeanne said, your booth mate may be 6 time zones away on another continent. How does that work? You can't just turn to someone and ask them a question, right? So that there will be some effort to develop standards for remote simultaneous interpreting. Now we have about 15 minutes left. What I would like to do is ask our participants, if they would like to ask a question, to please put it in the chat. And if you want to direct it at all the panelists, that's great, or you can direct it at a specific panelist. But the chat on your Zoom, for most people, that's going to be 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner, depending on your interface. But please put some questions in the chat. And I will monitor the chat. So don't be shy. So while here's a Q&A. There's also the Q&A function. All right. From Monica Ibarra, no question, just congratulations, excellent presentations. We'll go back to the chat. We have from Veronica Mendez, gracias por haber temas tan interesantes, and an excelente interpretación. And I apologize, no hablo español solamente, fingo hablar español. I just pretend to speak Spanish. I'm starting to learn it. So a question in the chat has come up. Let me get back to it. Fascinating subject. This is from Sébastien Saint-François. Will this be our new reality for many years, in your opinion? So take off your T&I hats and put on your epidemiology hats and your public policy hats, right? What do we think? What will our reality look like going forward?
Okay, may I address the question? I'll divide it into 2 parts. Interpreters and translators in Mexico who, well, the advantage of speaking prestigious languages, worldwide languages, this makes it very different from the indigenous languages. I think, as I already mentioned, that RSI is here to stay. I think we're either going to have to adapt or be left by the wayside, so to speak, very limited. No one will necessarily exclude you, but you exclude yourself if you can't keep up with the happenings. And I'm in that basket. I've had to run fast, and I think, well, how can you possibly move this and try to plug into your booth mate and switch? And I don't even want to think about relay. I mean, that would be mind-boggling. And oh, by the way, I have to interpret. Gosh, there's no time for that. I'm so busy. So I think just like with learning anything new, the learning curve can be very sharp, but we've got to go up the right side. On the other hand, with the indigenous languages, I think we're seeing a move already toward more courses of professionalization, because that's what's missing. The people who are often being certified are those who are strong bilinguals, and they deserve to pass the NALES test. But what we try to do in the AC, Intérpretes en Servicios Públicos y Comunitarios, we're working with groups on courses to professionalize, beginning with the difference between interpretation and translation, which, as basic as it might seem, they have no reason to know this. Many are bilingual teachers, that's the strongest pool. Others come from various walks of life. But, you know, just these very basic things that you would see, you know, in 101 or a summer course need to set, you know, what's our role in the whole communication network? Where do the interpreters and the translators fit in? And ethic concerns, how far can you go? Because we can't go very far, especially in court interpreting. I've been very active in the ATA over years and in NAGIT. You really are you have to not step on any stones and not stumble. You have to be very careful. You can't add, you know, your own. But on the other hand, with the indigenous languages, they have to beat around the bush, as we would say a lot of times. There's no direct equivalent, and they have more leeway culturally. Like if the judge says, why is it taking, you seem to be saying so many words? Well, I have to explain. I can't interpret word by word. I have to explain. And of course, for us, that's a real no. You don't explain. So I think we're going to see a trend. I think we're being pushed in the right direction because those who would like to be interpreters or translators in the indigenous languages, there's no school, there's no career. You can't go and get a licenciatura in interpretación like you can in English, Spanish, and French in Mexico. So, okay, I'll give my colleagues a shot at this too.
So is this the new normal?
La nueva normalidad.
So Donald or Ted?
Yeah, I'll go if I can. On the large global level, the pandemic will end. This is not the first time we've had a global pandemic, and it won't be the last. So COVID will end at some point. There will be vaccines, and we can get back to normal. The question is, what is the new normal going to be? Obviously, there'll be some changes, you know, on the society level, on the technological level. Again, I think he's really talking about for how it affects translators and interpreters. As I said, remote interpreting is going to be here to stay. And I don't see a big shift as far as translators. Obviously, you know, the health sciences have seen a boost in the last, you know, year or so, almost a year now, unfortunately, you know. But like all business cycles, supply and demand, that's going to level off at some point, and some other sector of the translation world will come back, you know. As a financial translator, you know, my sector has seen a big drop, and I'm really hoping that's not my new normal going forward, that my business level will return, you know. But we'll see. So again, there's going to be changes, and I think most of it will be technological, more for the interpreters, as far again as the remote offering goes, and as well as I said, for our training offerings, again, we're going to be much more global and more democratic as we go to hybrid events of in-person plus remote offerings. So.
Donald?
Really, I could not add anything more to what my learned colleague just said. It's going to go for translation. It's going to go back to normal levels, I think, for example, the airline industries, for translation, for tourism and things like that. But for remote, it's here to stay. But what will be the right balance? That's something that we're gonna find out over time.
Very good. One last quick question. I think Gonzalo, I believe, is signed in as CIMIC, and put 3 questions in the chat, but we've only time for one. RSI requires connectivity and equipment that indigenous language interpreters have no access to. What will be the impact? And the corollary to that is this situation different in the USA, Canada, or is this a regional issue? And I can answer the second is that indigenous interpreters who are not in big cities are often out in places with no broadband. And even if they are in big cities, they may be part of communities that don't have the wherewithal to get the equipment. But the RSI issue, what is the impact if moving to RSI when folks don't have the access? Maybe Georgeanne, you can start with that.
Yes, of course. That's a good question, a complicated question. We have to be careful with the use of cognitive because it could sound like there's a bias that those of us who speak European languages or Asian language have more cognitive development or better cognitively than those who are, say, underprivileged. There are no statistics to back up that the indigenous populations have a lower level of cognitive development. In other words, that this would be some kind of a natural situation that we were born that way, but rather the lack of access and the lack of stimulation for cognitive development is very different. And I think, you know, in Canada, and the ATA, NAGIT, and the US, and here, CEMIC, the OMT, are doing as much as possible to allow the speakers, and particularly the interpreters and translators of indigenous languages, to reach their potential. So far, they have not had the opportunity, so we don't know for sure what their potential is. It should be just like anybody else's, as long as they've had nutrition, which is not always the case. We all know a lot of the children in just a regular school some are offset by the fact that they're not well cared for at home, that they don't have their parents to oversee their homework to make sure that they eat properly, that they have enough to eat. So this is not just a matter of the indigenous populations, it's a matter of those populations that have not been afforded the opportunity to reach their potential to use their cognitive development. And that's one of the problems, of course, here in Mexico with the indigenous populations. How can you give them access? They're spread all over. They're not, you know, in one place. Oaxaca is the most important state in the sense, statistically. I don't say it's more important than others, but I mean, as far as having a greater diversity. But there are Indian languages in Baja California all the way up to the north, and these languages are highly at risk. But it's not just where you think, you know, Chiapas and Oaxaca and Guerrero, where the populations really are statistically noteworthy. But I think what's more important is the opportunity, and like you said, access. Forget, you know, there aren't many dictionaries, and those dictionaries in the indigenous languages have basically been developed by the Summer Institute of Linguistics, and often have a very religious overtone, undertone, however you want to put it.
Limited subject matters.
Exactly.
Saying it.
Exactly.
Right.
I was being careful there. But once again, you know, how relevant is that to the present day world? It's not very relevant. And of course, it'll become even less relevant when we get back to this nueva normalidad that nobody knows exactly what it's going to be, but it's going to be different. Okay.
So with that, we are just about out of time. Before I invite our distinguished, learned, and esteemed speakers to say just a couple of brief final words, this webinar has been recorded, and it will be made available on the FIT North America webpage, which is fairly small, but we will also share that link with ATA, with OTIAC, and with CEMIC, so that this webinar can be broadly shared with the membership of the FIT North America associations. And we'll go maybe in reverse order. And if you have an event tomorrow for International Translators Day, please let us know and how to find the details. So perhaps we'll go to Ted, because you're the next square over here.
Okay. Well, I just want to say thank you for everybody, to Bill for organizing this, and for my colleagues north and south of the border. It's good to see you again. And thanks to the attendees for your interest in this topic. And for those of you on ATA, again, we'll make this available when we get it from FIT North America, and it'll be available on the ATA website. I'll put in a plug for the ATA annual conference. Early bird registration just ended yesterday, so you've missed that one, but it's not too late to sign up. Go to atanet.org. Thank you.
Okay. Donald.
Thank you very much for Bill for organizing this, and Wozniak is going to hold its ITT day tomorrow at 5 o'clock Eastern time, and everybody who wants to practice their French is invited. And all the information is on Wozniak's website.
Yeah. Thank you, Donald.
Thank you.
And then
Me.
Georgeanne.
Okay, just a few final words. Thanks for organizing this. It brings us closer together. It gives us a chance to exchange information, which is very important. The CEMIC, of course, held an event this past Sunday. So many things are going on that we're trying not to overlap and distract the same audience. So it was very, very interesting. And you can check that out on the CEMIC webpage about the race, how this was carried out. Yesterday, the Proyecto Sensonte held an event with the game Jeopardy, but using questions from about translation and interpretation. That was very interested in. The prizes were a discount in the upcoming courses. The OMT, Organización Mexicana de Traductores, also a member, just like CEMIC, of the FEAT. Those are the two representative associations that belong to the FEAT. Always holds a special event on usually the last week in November, in conjunction, because the OMT's headquarters is in Guadalajara. And of course, that's when the Feria Internacional, the International Book Fair, is held, which is the second largest in the world. It's a marvelous event. So they try to join the two together to complement so that the attendees can have additional benefits. I also put a plug in for the ATA as a member. I think the associations are doing a lot. They have really, really come to serve us all in this time of crisis. And if we didn't have all of these associations, I think we would be really rowing upstream, so to speak. You know, how do you do it on your own, and what are others doing, and where is everybody, and how can I get help, and how do I know, you know, how I compare to other people? Regarding the indigenous populations, there's not one association that is in charge of this, but they're rather organizing by community, ethnic, and language groups. Okay.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone. Merci à tous pour votre assistance, and thank you for everyone for attending. Try to get both official languages of FIP involved here. And as I said, this will be posted soon, and I appreciate everyone's engagement and input and the great questions from the audience. And thank you to all the attendees. And with that, have a very good day.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.